Good evening, I'm very happy to see you tonight. And we are going to talk about some methodological issues related to Russian contemporary art and research of Russian contemporary art in particular. As you know, during the last year, we have been undertaking the project called the Family Tree of Russian Contemporary Art. And I would like to give you some background for this project. So the main goal for us as researchers was to identify as many names, as many artists as possible. Those artists that made a significant contribution into the history of Russian art. So we were thinking, what should we do in order to make this list of artists that are relevant for Russian contemporary art, especially as we speak about quite broad range of space, and how each place of this artist could be justified on this huge map of Russian contemporary art. We started our work 1 year ago. It was at the end of April 2014. And the basis for our work was the system of interrelations inside the Russian art. And those relations had to be based on some real documents. Just, it's very often that the researchers that study art sometimes just use some arbitrary connections. So we put Ilya Kabakov in the center of Russian art because he is the first and the only person who is well known. And he is well known in the whole world as Russian artist #1. And so, using the documents related to the biography of Ilya Kabakov became a starting point for us. And now we have over 200 artists and over 2,000 documents that are related to Ilya in some way or other. So as you can imagine, that tree was growing gradually, so it would have lots of ramifications, would have its roots back to the 1910 and 1920, those people that were the teachers for Russian nonconformists. So we realized that it was not just the works of art and the artists that we're working with. We realized that we could take it as some social network that was evolving over years. And that's why we decided to involve sociologists from St. Petersburg and Moscow. I'm very happy to welcome them here, and they're going to speak tonight as well. And whenever we speak about this social network, whenever we encounter this phenomenon of some global structure, when every element of it becomes a crucial part in art. And so we have to understand what place does this or that artist have in the place of this universe. So that's why I used Nikolai Kozlov's works, and you can see him here tonight. So that was the question that we asked ourselves. Who is the leader in today's Russian art? How can we identify that leadership? And in order to identify that leader, we had to ask many artists that belong to different generations. We had lots of interviews. And it was very often that the artist that never really taught anyone, that had quite that he lived his life in isolation, he turned out to be the character that many other artists mentioned for some reason. They said that his works of art influenced our art a lot, and that was the basis for us. So that's why we had to identify some social parameters that we call an art world of Moscow and Russia overall. Because it was important not just to focus on Moscow, but to draw the lines between center and periphery. Like moving from big star constellations to those areas where the stars were only beginning to be born. And that's why we have not just Russia, but Moldavia, Estonia, Ukraine, and then speaking about the cities, we can see Yekaterinburg, Krasnodar, Novosibirsk, and the art community that lived in those cities. It is also very important for us that this project is not going to finish when the exhibition is going to be opened in the new Garage Museum. We are going to continue this work, and I would like to give the floor to Dilyara Valeeva, who is a sociologist from High School of Economics, and she will tell you how her work looks like. Good evening. I'd love to start today's discussion and this meeting with explaining how we try to analyze the chronology of events and exhibitions in particular in Russian art in the periods between 1960 to 1999, and then discuss some interpretations. So I'd love to give you a short introduction and tell you what has already been done before us. I mentioned some art projects and curatorial projects and some theoretical works of sociologists and culturologists that tried to interpret the connections between artists as a social network. So the most famous curatorial project was Inventing Abstraction, that took place in MoMA, where curators, together with researchers, tried to visualize the history of abstract art as the history of relations between artists, and show that the history of art was always about the friendship, some personal relations, and some other things. Then the second project was more like an art project, but still it's very important to mention it today. This is the work created by Irvin Group. It still exists in the internet. So Irvin Group artists tried to create a database that included the artists and the main idea was to redefine the history of European art, and everybody can participate in it. And again, as the history of relations, connections, influences, and personal relations. And finally, one more project by the artist who is creating social networks, and here you can see artists and the relations between them and their participation in exhibitions. So we can make a conclusion based on those projects that the history of art is not just about changing styles, some kind of evolution, and some groups of artists. It's always some set of enterprising individuals who are trying to reinvent themselves. And this field of interaction becomes the key theme for them, because they can always influence each other and re-establish the position of other members of this network. Apart from curatorial and artists' projects, I'd love to mention some theories by culturologists and sociologists that appeared back in the 60s and 90s. They were also trying to rethink the career of artists as something that was always changing, that something that was always based on relations. And in particular, it was Bourdieu field theory that said that artists always compete with themselves, that they change their positions, and their success doesn't only depend on their individual position, but also on the positions of other participants of this field. And also Gouffre theory used to say that the careers in the world of art are quite relative, and also this position of the artists in the network makes a big difference. And we try to analyze the history of Russian non-official art, and in particular the exhibitions and the participation of the artists in those exhibitions. So we tried to see who were the key figures, and what kind of communities or clusters or subgroups of artists could be identified, basically to see and to consider the place of artists in that network. Now I'm going to tell you about data description. So what we have done was analyzing the exhibitions between 1960 to 1999. So we focused on collective exhibitions. We haven't yet touched upon individual exhibitions. So we take artist participation in exhibitions as the social network, and why we decided to focus on exhibitions, because the scientific department of the Garage Museum provided us lots of data about those events that took place at that time. It was a huge database that had performances, different actions, different exhibitions, many other things. But we selected exhibitions as a main thing, because it has a place, it has a certain duration, it has a certain number of participants, because sometimes when we speak about some actions, sometimes it's not quite clear who participated in it, so that's why we decided to focus on exhibitions in particular. And also exhibitions are very important for artists, because it means that curators or the community recognize artists to be important people, that they have some role to play. Of course, there are some minuses about this process, because it's not the artists that choose to participate in some exhibition, and also it's not necessarily that the artists know each other, even though they participate in the same exhibition. It could be just a curatorial decision, and so their works are exhibited at the same place. And of course, in the 60s, it was a very difficult it was very difficult to organize exhibitions, so maybe some performances were more important, but still, we analyzed exhibitions, and I just wanted to briefly describe you the period of the 1960s, and then later on I'll describe other decades as well. So if we want to visualize the network of the artists and the exhibitions that were held in the 60s. We can say that there is a core in the center and on the right, and some figures that are somewhere on the periphery. And if you take a closer look, and those people that are located in the center, we can see famous people like Kabakov, Masterkova, Komar and Melamid, and many others. So what we did next was to identify the network clusters, because analyzing social networks can help you to see some subgroups or some communities or clusters within this social network. And we based on the it was based on the density of connections between the nodes. So the more dense the connections are, the more it would be more likely that those nodes would belong to the same community. And using this algorithm for the network analysis, we could confirm our initial hypothesis that there was one core, and this is the green cluster of artists, then the blue cluster and the red cluster. So let's take a look who belongs to all those clusters. So cluster number one. It consists of green nodes, and it includes quite well-known people. If you try to interpret it, we can see that the mainly conceptual artists belong here, as well as Lianosov School and Sretinsky Boulevard's school artists. So that was the group marked in green on the left. Now the second cluster, it's cluster number 2, and Eli Bilutin's studio and Sretinsky Boulevard artists belong to this blue cluster, like Falk, Neizvestny, and many others. Then as to the third cluster, it's not very big, and mainly they belong to graphics Gorkom, so they are blue nodes on the top. And as to the red cluster, it was difficult for me to interpret this group. It's a question for art historians, because it could be just a random group that appeared there by chance, so we can discuss it. And then there were also some small clusters with just 2 people in them, but again we can discuss that later after the presentation. So we try to see how this network of the 60s split into communities, and I wanted to focus on the top artists that had a very important held a very important place in that network. So first of all, let's see how many connections every node had. Let's say there are 2 artists, A and B, So the first artist, artist A, had exhibited his works together with 5 artists, and the second artist B exhibited his works with just 2 artists. And of course, the connections of the first artists were much more than the number of connections of the second artist, artist B. So. And this shows, in simple terms, how popular the person was. It means that those artists were quite popular and exhibited their works quite often, and in the company of many artists. Then the second was the measure that is called betweenness. And this showed where this knot was located, somewhere in between. And so let's say we have again 2 artists, and they exhibited their works with, let's say, 3 artists. But if we took a closer look at the connections of their partners, it would give you a very interesting data, because it means that this artist A connect different clusters, whereas artist B had some limited number of connections, and so he doesn't play that role of an intermediary. And again, this measure can give you a lot of information about how popular the artists were, and it could show that those artists were in demand, that they were exhibited at different events, different exhibitions, and could suit different formats. And finally, it was the status of surrounding environment. So let's say artist A has 2 close partners, and artist B also has 2 close partners. But again, if we take a look at a further, say, neighborhood, we can say that A had a bigger a number of neighbors, and so his or her status was higher. And it means that those artists were exhibited with the artists that had also high status, and the works were exhibited with the artists that exhibited very often. So like stars were exhibited together with stars. And what do we have in the 70s? In the 70s, more artists came on stage, more exhibitions began to be organized. So we also got some clusters in this network. And again, let's try to interpret how those clusters were formed and who belongs to which cluster. So the first cluster was the yellow dots, and again conceptual artists and Tretyakov Boulevard artists, неизвестный Кизельвальтер, Pivovarov, and some others belong to this cluster. Then the second cluster was red nodes on the left, and Lianozovo school belonged here, and the artists that belong to the movement движение, and also Krapivnitsky and some others. Then the third cluster that appeared were orange nodes on the bottom on the left, and the artists that exhibited their works in the Optart Gallery and They include Rabin, Kommersant, Melamed, Zakharov, and others. And the fourth cluster is a group on the right at the bottom, and I couldn't really give any interpretation to this cluster. And again, we can discuss if it makes sense to divide them into these kind of clusters. So let's take a look at the 1970s and see if there were any new figures that appeared during that time. So the top artists changed sometimes. So again, the top artists are those artists whose works were shown very often. And so here you can see the top 12 artists, and in terms of their status, meaning that the artists, those that were shown with just as good artists, Kharitonov, Rabin, Plavinsky, and many others. Then let's move on to the 1980s. The network is growing bigger, the connections are growing bigger, and we have about 20,000 connections. And again, we can see a very dense nucleus on the top and a very dense nucleus at the bottom. And we have some connecting pieces around them, connecting artists. The big cluster was the green cluster at the bottom. I call them as a all-stars cluster. And here you can see the continuation of this list, and Sretinsky Boulevard, conceptualists, and many others. So very famous people that were exhibited together, and maybe that was the reason why they all got together and formed this big cluster. Then the second group was the orange group at the top, but I couldn't really interpret them. And again, you can see some well-known people, the artists that were shown quite often. Some of the names are not as well known. Then the third group was the blue group on the left. Some conceptual artists, Furmanный переулок, and medical hermeneutics also belong to this cluster. And the fourth cluster included conceptualists. Actually, as you can see, the conceptualists can be found in all clusters, and also the new wave art movement in Moscow and Leningrad. Kizi Walter, Prigov, and others. And speaking about the 1980s, and the artists that were exhibited very often were Prigov, Volkov, Ovchinnikov, and some others. Also Zvezdochotov. Zvezdochotov will be a top artist in the 90s as well. And so speaking about the those that were in between, we have the same artists. And speaking about the status of their surroundings, we can see Albert here, who didn't figure in other lists. So in the 1990s, again, lots of artists on our diagram, lots of connections between them, but we can see less clusters that could be divided and could be identified as compared to the 1960s and 1970s. We can see like B core here, which is centrally located. And if we use the algorithm to draw the community, we would have a very mixed up picture. We try to interpret it together with art historians a month ago, but we understood that it was very difficult to figure out what happened here. Maybe it was related to the fact that in the 1990s many exhibitions appeared, lots of artists were shown together when the curators tried to think about the history of unofficial art. But let's take a closer look at the core of this diagram. And you can see some familiar people. And those artists on the left belong to the generation of the 60s and 70s, and on the right are older artists that belong to the next generation, the 90s and 80s. At least they were actively working during that time. So, speaking about the top artists of the 1990s, we see here Zvezdochotov, Makarevich, Gutov, Leiderman, Kabakov, Teroganyan. Speaking about in between, we have a similar list, and then as to status, Zvezdochotov, Makarevich, Leiderman had the highest status. So I can make some conclusions, and then we can have a discussion. So what we did was to identify some clusters or subgroups in the networks of exhibitions that were part of unofficial art scene. In 1960s and 1970s, it was much easier to identify and interpret clusters because they were some obvious nuclear, and then in the 1990s it was less obvious, probably because the number of artists went up as well as the number of exhibitions. Then there were lots of retrospective exhibitions when the curators try to rethink the history of the art of the 60s and 70s, and then there was also more opportunity for international exhibitions. And we also try to identify the key figures in the networks, and we can see that there was a change of generations over this period of time, and some of those artists changed their positions in the 90s. As to intermediaries, the picture is very similar, and as to the status, we can also see that there was this change of generations, but again, there were lots of connections between them. Thank you for your attention. So now let's move on to the discussion. Shall we? Do you have any questions? I guess I could ask you a question related to those clusters. Are they generated by some software, some program that analyzes some data that you provide? Yes, there is an algorithm that we use, and it was based on some algorithm. So it means if there were more connections between certain figures, they would probably belong to the same cluster. So it was an automatic thing. we used some mathematical methods for dividing that data, and so it would be very interesting now to ask art historians whether it made any sense, or maybe it was just a random process. Looking at the screen, I was thinking if such objective analysis could give you a picture that confirmed some art historians' hypothesis that could be very subjective. For example, the fourth cluster of the 1960s generation were all those artists that belong to semi-official art, the group of 8 that were present in the context of Russian contemporary art, more in a shadow way. Also, Ilya Kobakov was not the key figure in the 60s and 70s, and this could be again explained by the historical reasons, because Ilya Kobakov refused to participate in group exhibitions in the 70s and 80s, and when he left Russia in the late 80s, he came to Russia very rarely as a participant of some exhibitions. Maybe somebody has some other considerations. I wanted to ask you about the method. At first you described the equal value of the connection related to artists' participation in the exhibitions. Did you have any qualifying characteristics? For example, you mentioned some tours to the forest and or some museum exhibition. Was it like the same connection or different types of connections? Because in the 90s, for example, Brenner was not there in your data because he liked street performances, and maybe you could also one could say that, for example, an exhibition held in a flat had a different nature than a gallery exhibition. We analyzed exhibitions only. We did not analyze some actions or performances or some tours to the forest. It's a drawback, but it was easier for us to identify the boundaries as to what we were analyzing, because it was very difficult to document who, for example, went to that forest. It's the matter of any collective action. Or, for example, Smolovsky had some action near the embassy, and then there were homeless people that participated there. So were the participants or not? So we decided to focus on the exhibitions only, because the exhibition always has a catalog, a list of artists, and it is documented somewhere. I have a very simple question. The first thing is that you don't have Leningrad here. No, there were some, but very few. So we can say that there are none. Because if you just calculate the number of exhibitions in Leningrad, you would have a different analysis. And then the second thing, how accurate is your database? For example, when I was working on the history of art, there was a lot of data that I had to work with that was wrong. For example, I, of course, used some archive materials that had some works of Andrey Shutov. So like I had to go there, but also I used some materials from the newspaper, and I guess there could also be mistakes in your data. So I just wanted to ask you about this database. Well, and also sometimes those people that were not participating in the exhibition could be mentioned in the catalogs. Well, we provided all those materials for analysis, and we created those databases. So actually, it has. We had Leningrad or St. Petersburg. It's just there's not so much materials. Not so many materials about it. It's just that we do not have that many materials that would confirm, that could be used as evidence for the exhibitions. We hope that we would expand our research group and involve our St. Petersburg colleagues that have some profound information. As to the database, it was being formed over 25 years, and the list of the exhibitions held in the 60s, 70s, and 80s was based on archive records by Talochkin, and he actually created catalogs for all flat exhibitions, and he collected the catalogs of the exhibitions that took place abroad. So the evidence is not just the names of the names listed in the catalog, but also the correspondence with Talochkin. And then we have a very big database related to the late 80s and the 90s. We have catalogs, the tickets, the invitations, and we used cross-analysis of information, because sometimes on the poster there would be one list of artists, then in the review there was another list of artists indicated. So we used the photos of expositions that could give you could give you information about some artist participation and his works. So of course there might be some mistakes, but it's still quite reliable. Mikhail Mindlin started his career as an artist, and he worked in his studio in Furmanny переулок. And in his memoirs, he writes that he was invited to become a functionary in art when he still was an artist, and so he came to the Ministry of Art wearing extravagant clothes because he was an artist still. So what how did you make the pairs? What values did you use? For example, the title of the exhibitions, or what other things? Well, the scientific department of the Garage Museum gave us data with the date of the exhibition, the name of the exhibition, the list of exhibitions, and curator's name. And could be also some extra information related to organizers or some other things. So you had just these 4 parameters, right? Yes, we focused on those. And so you had to draw this network based on that. What was the main goal? The main goal was to analyze the exhibition lists But what about the objective? To identify the leaders of generations that shape not only the social landscape of art, but also hypothetically influence the style and image of the decade. But did you have any preliminary concepts, hypotheses that you had, like that could be confirmed, for example? That yes, it was right, or no, it was not right. We had many hypotheses. Like I said, at first we thought that we could identify the key figures of the history based on the connections that they were surrounded with. And Dilyara's study confirmed that hypothesis, even though we developed that hypothesis on a different grounds, like professional influence, friendship, apprenticeship, family, friendly relations. I guess we didn't really have a hypothesis, like we didn't see how X, for example, defined Y. It was more a description. We tried to identify this network, what clusters it consisted of, and so who were the key figures. So it was more like a descriptory work. I wanted to emphasize that it was important for us to get some unexpected information, maybe to see some unusual angle, point of view. So you didn't really use the information about like tours to the forests or some other trips outside Moscow. It's true, we didn't take those tours to the forest as a special event, but the artists, those artists that participated in those tours appeared at the exhibitions in the 90s. But then in the 90s, for example, there were lots of actions. For example, Smolovsky act when he tried to use 3 letters in the Red Square, and they were real people that were to perform, to become those letters. Yes, you're right. I guess we should have included that data because we have those materials. Maybe we should have analyzed the co-authors of that act and the spectators as well. But we should also listen to one more report that analyzed the Russian press. There's another question. So, did you have some unexpected things? Since you mentioned some things that were confirmed, and maybe some other things, some unexpected discoveries. I'm not a specialist in contemporary art, but I can say that in the 70s and 80s there were some nuclear, whereas in the 90s it was just one big core, so the structure was different. It's a completely new material for me. we had a preliminary meeting where we discussed the provisional findings. So it was very important for me that Alexander Kharitonov was the leader in the 1960s, because he was never a symbolic figure for me. For me, he was some backwater figure, and like for me, it would be Rabin, Krasnopersky, Krapivnitsyn, who would be outstanding people. And so that's why we are trying to think about all these things, and that's why we're having this meeting tonight, just to better understand how this world works, instead of having just some myths, towards more objectified analysis. So what result are you going to have? Are you going to put Kharitonov on top of Kabakov? I'm not a mathematician, but I don't really understand the proportion, because, for example, the number of exhibitions was much less in the 60s, if we compare it with the 90s. And you should take it into account, because you used all those exhibitions that were indicated in the documents. And so when we compared the artists, we didn't mean the quantity. For example, Plavinsky, who was on the top in the 1960s, let's say he exhibited with 50 other artists, and Zvezda exhibited with 350 artists in 1990. So it means that Plavinsky had to participate in just 5 exhibitions, and Zvezda had to participate in 100 exhibitions to be on top in the 1990s. Do you have any other questions related to this report? If not, then let's move on to the second report. Maybe you have more comments to make. So I'd like to invite Marina Safonova and Rita Kuleva. So we were analyzing the works of critics and their articles. So we analyzed the Russian press. It was given us by the Garage Museum, and we concentrated on the 1990s. And we used different magazines, so we are going to see different perspectives. So we are going to talk about art research using network analysis, and we're going to use a sociological perspective. We're going to tell you about the data and the metrics that we used, and we'll provide a detailed analysis of publications appeared in Художественный journal, Art magazine, and then we'll compare some other publications like newspaper Kommersant, Сегодня, and Arts magazine. And Maria will tell you more about the theoretical provisions. I'll tell you about the conclusions that we made and the data that we processed and the questions that we asked ourselves, thinking if the earlier research could be similar to ours, and in what way. So Catani and Simone Feriani was an important research for us, but they used a different kind of materials. And if we speak about the art, which is recognized as more elitist art, so Catani and Feriani had a research that analyzed mass-scale art because they analyzed the filmmakers involved with making Hollywood films, and they created a database IMDb, and they were interested in the connections between core crew, producers, film directors, and others. So what did they do? They had a very specific network. It looks similar to Dilyara's network, and if you look at this picture, you can see that there are some crew members, directors and producers that participate in film production, and we can see the numbers which stand for crew members. Then we have letters A, B, and C on the top. It means that people could know each other from different films. And so we can see that you can go from one modus of interaction. You can have a different modus of interaction, and these bimodular networks. And so we also use the same principle of bimodular networks. And so we worked with critics on the one hand as one modus, and curators and artists were the second modus. And so it was related on either co-participation or co-presence in one or the other thing. So Catani and Feriani discovered that this structure of interaction had the structure of the nucleus and periphery. So if we speak about the nucleus or the core, it had lots of connections and very high density, whereas the periphery dots would usually be connected to the core and not necessarily to other participants. So they found some regular patterns in the structure. They discovered that people in the core were not positively evaluated by critics that received many awards. Like only those people that were located in like semi-periphery, on the way between the center to periphery, were those people that got more awards. And the reason was that those people that were on the very in that area were more beneficial just because they could experiment and they also could get the funding for their projects. Whereas, for example, those that were located on the periphery could not really get funding easily just because nobody knew them. And those located in the center, they, for example, could get funding but were not brave and bold in their experiments. So then Uzi and Jared had a project related to Broadway musical. and they, for example, worked with that data that analyzed the musicals that were not successful, and they studied not only how successful those musicals were with critics, but also the commercial success, and they focused on some specific type of connections. For example, Milgram theory is very interesting, that says that people inside the social work live together with neighbors. So there's an agent in the middle who is surrounded by neighbors. And the neighbors of this agent know each other, and the information about this spreads very fast. Apart from the density of this neighborhood, there's a distance in the network, so you can just get through a small number of connections in order to get to the end of this trajectory. So if the person is controlled to a higher degree, then he doesn't experiment easily. So they found out a very interesting curve. When the Broadway world was young and the connections were many, the financial success and the success with critics wasn't that big, but when the connections grew and the information could spread more rapidly, the success factor was more relevant, so success was higher, and then finally it resulted in the effect of conformity and lack of artistic ideas or creative ideas, and that was the reason why the success of Broadway musicals was lower. Then another study by Forster and Burgati focused on the agents that were between people and producers. They call them brokers, those people that chose musical bands who had to perform for the public. So it depended on the type of audience, and so the structure of interaction of those brokers differed because of that. So if they, for example, brokers worked with young bands, interacted with their colleagues, with their peers, so they would ask each other who among young bands was worth seeing, who would deserve to go on stage. And those managers that wanted to more like reproduce good music, they interacted with music producers themselves. So we were interested in the structure of interaction between our brokers, and in our case it was critics. I would also like to add one more study findings, and it was about computer scientists that analyzed open data on the portal allmusic.com. And so they found two types of data, and so they created a social network that and they were the networks of similar type, and like in allmusic.com, experts said that if you listen to Mick Jagger, you would probably like David Bowie and Tina Turner, because musically they're very similar. And then there are networks of collaboration when the artists work together and And for example, we have some confirmed data that Mick Jagger collaborated with Keith Richards. And one of the conclusions, which is very interesting, was that the more central figures in those two networks were different people. For example, the networks of some similar things that were created by the critics, and where we can see some stars that were similar to other stars, and many other performers like R.E.M. or Clapton. Then speaking about the network of collaborations, the figures were not that obvious. A lot of connections, for example, could be found with the percussionist or sound director, just because those percussion player could work both with ethnic musicians and some other kind of musicians, and that's how they became so significant. And one of the perspective for analysis, it would be good to see the principles, to analyze the principles of centrality, which is related to participation in the exhibition on one hand, just what Dilyara was talking about, and the recognition by the critics that we were doing. First of all, I would like to thank the scientific department of the Garage Museum. They gave us 3 databases, and we split them into 2 parts. The one was specialized publications, художественный journal, the art magazine, during the period between 1993 to 1995, which included 173 articles, and then non-specialized publications, the newspaper Сегодня and the newspaper Kommersant. So, like Dilyara already explained, when the 2 artists participated in the same exhibition, they became connected. And in our case, if 2 artists participated in the same exhibition, they not only become connected, but also the critic becomes connected to those 2 artists. That's why we had 2 types of networks: by modular network with 2 types of agents: critics, agents, or some other persons mentioned in the article, or unimodular network, when we analyze only the connections between the artists based on the article. And we also try to explain their co-presence by creating some attributes. If you have any other ideas, your ideas are welcome. So we used gender, generation, because for us it was, we examined when those artists worked, and then the location where the artist was based. So we're going to speak about 4 bimodular networks, and about a unimodular network. So first of all, we will focus on художественный journal, the art magazine, and then we'll compare the newspaper Сегодня and Kommersant. I haven't mentioned that we worked with bimodular networks, not only just critics and some personalia, but also critic/institution, critic/events, and so we wanted to also to examine what art production meant if we speak about art critics. So, what do we have if we speak about художественный journal, the art magazine? So, we focusing here on critics and art groups. So, green points are critics and red points are art groups. So, here we can see the nucleus that Masha mentioned earlier, which means that there are many critics that speak about the same art groups. And it's a specific phenomenon for a художественный journal when there are some critics that describe some special group of artists that nobody writes about. And the attribute related to location that showed where the critic is based and where the art group is based. Shows the geographic area. So blue dots refer to St. Petersburg, then red dots refer to Moscow. Then there are some dots that refer to Hamburg, Odessa. On the left, for example, we can see Mameshev Monroe, which describes many different associations of artists in St. Petersburg. Then we can speak about critics and events, and here we can see that the picture is different from art groups and critics, because usually there's just one critic which is fixed to one event. So there's no structure that no structure with some dense core. There are many lines instead. So, for example, here on the right, we can see lots of events mentioned by just one critic, or maybe one event that was described by many critics. Then a completely different picture can be seen when we analyzed critics and art institutions. And then Maria, you're welcome. Here we can see the structure of bimodular network. So the red dots are artists, and the critics are marked by green dots. So you can see that the size is different, and the size of the network is growing. So there are 90 critics and 429 magazines from художественный journal, art magazine. So it's very interesting to see again the core here and the periphery. So the critics in the center and the critics in the periphery write in a different way. There are critics that write about some artists that are interesting only for themselves. But some critics have different strategy, because here in the core you can see these red dots of artists that are worth attention. And many critics think that those artists deserve attention. We were also thinking about different strategies and the relations of dependency, at least the dependencies of the artists. For example, these artists were described only in the articles by that critic, by just one critic. So we called these artists to be that critic's clientele. As to other artists that are located in the center, they are not dependent on their critics, because it means that many critics are willing to write about them. So if one critic doesn't want to write about them, their position within this central field won't change much. And we wanted to show you what artists belong to this area. There are Smolovsky and many others. So it means that their position is more independent, as if we compare it with those artists that were located on the periphery. I just wanted to add that we can see not just critics here. So again, critics are marked by green and artists are marked by red. Sorry, artists are marked by red, or curators that are mentioned by critics. So here we can see the top artists that are mentioned by many critics, and for us it was a big intrigue. In May we had lots of discussions, and we thought that maybe the situation in non-specialized press would be different. So on the left you can see the artists that were mentioned by many critics, and on the right you can see critics that mentioned many artists. It's true that the agents were different, and there were some critics that could be also artists at the same time. Here you can see the slide about the centrality. So centrality is a connection with other influential figures, and we wanted to talk about the position of critics. So the critics are marked by green. So we wanted to see if there was any strategy that the critics had for their stories, and we thought that maybe that the critics that write about artists recognized by many is gaining its reputation and becomes more competitive, because they discuss those that are already recognized. And here you can see that like the central big critics write about artists recognized by many people, and it shows by the size of the circle. And this is a unimodular network. When we put together the artists mentioned by many critics, and we used different attributes, like I mentioned, generation attribute, for example. So it was one of our assumptions to check if the artists would be statistically clustered based on their generation, the generation that they belong to. And we found out that during the 1990s, the center was mixed up, because there were representatives of the 1960s and 70s and 80s, just the same as Dilyara said. And so here we can see this mixed picture, and we can't really say that the new artists that appeared in the 90s were closer to each other. And again, we speak about critics. It means that those artists were mentioned not necessarily with each other, but with the representatives of different generations, different movements. Here you can see statistical clusterization, that the center marked by green are those persons that have more connections, bigger numbers of connections, and so they are close together, even though they can relate to different generations. And now let's move on to the second part of our analysis, non-specialized press, so the newspapers Сегодня and Kommersant, as compared to художественный journal, the art magazine. So here you can see a large center and the periphery with exclusive clientele. So the size is very important, 90 critics and 400 plus artists. So if we take a look at Kommersant, we can see that there is a core. So it means that critics write about well-established and recognized artists. And suddenly some big critics appear, and so they have a very large clientele, so the size of their clientele is expanded. You can see it if you compare it with the first picture. And again, the coverage is quite large, 530 artists that are written about. And the next picture, there is a small nucleus, but as to the clientele of that critic, for example, grows a lot, so it gets really big. So what does it mean? That there's no consensus within these critics, or maybe this critic booked a special position for himself, like a position of a pioneer, the discoverer. And but this is the question. And also the size, 414 artists, 46 critics. So what happened next? We had to put together all those three networks. I can say that about 1,000 artists were mentioned in the publications in the 90s. 970 artists. So it means that there's a lot of information related to location, generation, so we haven't done it yet. What we have is a gender parameter. This was very fast because ladies were very few. We didn't ask them who they feel themselves to be, so we have only pragmatic data. And so we made the conclusion that there were very few women, and if there were some, they were not central figures, they were located on the periphery. So the picture is quite sad. And this is a bimodular network that includes critics and artists. Just like gender research shows related to the field of sociology, it always happens that if you want to build some strategy in a hard to survive place, women unite. So I wanted to show you this, that here you can see this can see this accumulation of dots. It means that there are more women, but they're not centrally located. And it's interesting that female critics are much more there than female artists. And so it's very interesting to think about gender proportion in the world of art. And concluding our analysis, we wanted to show you the top lists. So, and you can see some differences in the lists that Dilyara had. Just because some artists chose some alternative career, like Oleg Kulik, Alexander Brenner, and Anatoly Osmolovsky. And actually, we were very surprised to see this. Do you mean the mentioning in the article? Yes, mentioning in the article and co-presence. So, like this figure, 16,537, they are weighted connections. For example, if there is a co-presence of two critics and then the number of times that the critic mentioned. Is this important? Like how much the critic told you about some artist. And also another riddle, another thing that puzzled us was Ilya Glazunov that came on the surface here. Ilya Glazunov is a bad word. You can use the signal beep in order to replace his name. So this is just the very beginning. This is something that we've done very fast because we started our work not very long ago, and we've got lots of plans. We could create the networks with either positive or negative sign, and we could also show this balance in our diagrams. It just would mean more work because this work was done very quickly. And the thing is that the number of nodes is growing very fast because it's about 1,000. And then one other value that we miss is the measure of recognition. Like apart from the names mentioned in the articles, it would be also interesting to use this measure. Like for example, for Hollywood or musicals, you could use either the number of awards or the amount of money that the musical made. So maybe we could use some encyclopedia or some textbooks that mention some artists' names, but maybe they won't be that many. Who is Semyon Chukov? Who is Semyon Chukov? He is on your list. Maybe he's the father of Ivan Chukov. Antonio is looking for mistakes. Well, I'm always scanning the information that I see on the screen. It's my work. You should use this theory in the right way. This is a fluctuation. This is all about fluctuation. So we'll be happy to hear your comments or suggestions. that we could add some qualitative analysis, and it would be good to include some interviews because, of course, this context is related closely to the cultural production in the magazine, how it was all done. So we would be happy to get more data from you. Okay, thank you very much. So let's move on to the Q&As. Do you have any questions? Ms. Prince, like Gutov. So, speaking about the expanding list of sources, you have just Kommersant and Сегодня newspapers that are non-specialized, non-profile publications, but I think that they were professional publications because those were the only newspapers that wrote about art apart from художественный журнal, the art magazine. But for example, if you expanded this list by non-profile, non-specialized publications like Megapolis Express or Komsomolskaya Pravda, do you think the map would change? I can't really say if it will change a lot, but it would be interesting to see because we would probably see a different group. Because here we can see professional recognition, whereas in those publications that you mentioned, we would probably have the artists that are recognized on a mass scale, because usually these people are different, like the artists recognized by public at large and the artists recognized by critics and professional community. And also the artists that participated in different actions and performances probably would figure much more, because they would be mentioned much more frequently. I can say that in the 90s, many professionals worked in non-specialized publications, and I can give you many names. So they knew art very well. It was a unique situation when, like, the most yellow, like Bulova press had art reviewers that were professionals. Then we have the question about format or censorship, because, for example, a critic can't say something in Komsomolskaya Pravda, something that he could, for example, say in художественный журнал. Thank you very much. It was amazing to see this. You mentioned the measure of recognition. But if you analyze critics and press, maybe you could also analyze the size of circulation, because the more readers the magazine has, the more recognition, for example, might be. But it's all about volatility. You could also think about the market, about the representation of artists in the galleries, but this is related to a different thing. It's related to sales. I haven't mentioned, but I should have mentioned that we had a preliminary meeting on the 8th of May when we just started our conversation, when we were stuck because it's very difficult to identify this measure of recognition, the price of success. For example, Dmitry Gutov would probably lose to Nikos Safonov, and that bad word. But we have galleries like exhibition halls, and so maybe you could use this parameter of those that were represented in the galleries and those who were not. It could be one of the measures. But for example, the gallery in Трехпрудный переулок, are you going to consider it a gallery? Well, yes. Well, at least it's a good word, this gallery in Трехпрудный переулок. Well, there are different places that were important. There was the Gallery of France, then Petliura's gallery, Belka International. There were some workshop studios in Baumanskaya. Well, there's no direct answer for you guys. And we hoped you could give us some idea about the measure of recognition. Well, as you can see, you can't get any direct answer from us. But is it possible to receive data related to galleries? Are they going to be quantitative? Is it going to be quantitative data? We have some lists of artists that were exhibited in different galleries during the 1990s, and the number of their works, right? It's very difficult to say because Moscow Fine Art exhibited paintings, and Excel Gallery exhibited projects, and you can't really split it into objects or items. For example, it could be just one work in Excel and 25 paintings in Moscow Fine Art, because it was very often that the gallery specialized on one type of art. I have a long statement. I'd love to say something to everyone, beginning with you, Sasha, and your idea about the family tree of Russian contemporary art. It's not expressed directly, but as I feel we are looking for the most successful artist as a result of those three projects. What's the point of looking for these most successful artists? Then in both studies, you sort of come up with a puzzle. So very beautiful pictures, and we have to understand what this picture misses. And the uniting point is the power of money, politics and economics. If we are to calculate every connection in terms of quality, trying to think what it means in political and economic context, the story would become completely different. And finally, the fundamental fault of sociological study, it was something that I mentioned already on the 8th of May, but I feel that you don't trust me. Works and artists are different things. And like as a result of this, we have many dead artists that had many works, but they were not physically there, so they could not really influence exhibitions in any way. And on the other hand, we have live artists that had connections between themselves, like Valentina Krapivnitskaya, the wife of Rabin. And nobody took Valentina Krapivnitskaya seriously, but the situation was like the artists worked like on the package basis, and I could compare it to geographical maps that were produced with big numbers of toponyms, like we have Ivanovo, but we have this Ivanov, and many people would ask, so what does it mean, Ivanov? Is it a village or the city, or what is it? No, and the key person, the responsible person would say, no, it was Ivanov who stayed over the night here. So it's like the principal difference between the work and participation, the presence of the artists. You remember Marina Abramovich exhibition, and the presence of the artist's work. So they're different things: the presence of the work of art and the presence of the artists. So apart from all those things, what is an exhibition? The exhibition is a historically non-stable thing. So just like comparing your studies, I can say that exhibition and individual works are all about media presence. As for example, nobody saw Alexander Brenner's performance. Maybe there were just 30 people, but the audience of his performance grew exponentially, just thanks to media. So speaking about exhibitions and whether they were real events, it's something that we can just put on your networks as a result. It's an interesting thing, but I think your idea was different. You wanted to provide some objective result. So the goal to find this most successful artist makes no sense. Well, you can confirm that Ilya Kabakov was a very influential figure. So what would it give to you in terms of quality? Well, we didn't have this goal to find the most successful artist. We wanted to present ourselves. We wanted to take a more distanced look at ourselves, because we have to tell our story to the whole world, to the world that doesn't speak Russian. So we have to build a certain hierarchy of relations that makes our art look the way it looks for us, but we see it from inside. And I could give you a provocative example. It's also about power and money. We inherited this art. We got this legacy of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. We can't influence it in any way. We can redefine the priorities. For example, we can say that artist A is really good, and we're sorry that his friends thought that he was nothing. We can review or revise this history. but we'll have to involve a lot of power, a lot of authority and money to change that history. I just wanted to tell you how the history was built. The circles of non-official art was supported by the collectors from abroad. For example, some ambassadors or some diplomats or some trade representatives that was coming to Moscow with a list. The list of artists that he had to visit, the list of studios, and that was a must for a visit. And those were on the top of those lists, no matter what embassy we talk about, Brazil, the US, or Australia. Those artists were the face of the Russian art. We do not, we shouldn't, build this platform and put Konstantin Zvezda-Chotov on the top of it. We just have to understand ourselves. But this is the logic of likes. No, we're trying to think about the methodology that can help us identify those leaders. Oh, okay, you say that methodology is not perfect. May I add something? We know this place, but we are inside it, and you can't really see anything from outside. For example, I can say that it was interesting for us who the critics wrote for, and how the symbolic capital was growing. For example, speaking about Kulik and Glazunov, their capital was growing, and even for the people that were not professionals in the field, who were not necessarily interested in art, they heard about their names, and maybe they don't know the very top figures, but they know Glazunov. So this is the product of the critic. The critic provides this information, and it becomes a product. So, and then it was interesting to see what defines the top places and what defines bottom places. Is there any politics or economics that can predict those things? I want to give a piece of advice for critics: never mention Glazunov. I think using paper media is always complicated because of interpretation. Like you say that we're having this ball, and it's the same in research. It's difficult to think which side you should use to get access to it. And I think the first study lacks localization parameter. Of course, exhibitions is a good thing, but the place, the venue where this exhibition was held is very important, because if you participate in an exhibition in Leonozova's barracks, very often is one thing, but if you participate in the exhibition in Malaya Gruzinskaya is a different thing. But they are all filters. So we can, of course, add some filters. If you had it, then this ball would split into communities more clearly, and then you would have it as a table. So it wouldn't be that general as those diagrams looked like. And the more values you have, the more accurate your analysis will be. I guess 4 values is not enough. Of course, and this is what I started our discussion with. This is an ongoing study. Our colleagues worked with those materials that we provided only for 4 months, and we're going to continue this research. Of course, we want the better quality, and I guess we should have more filters, and that's why we invite everyone to improve this model if it can be used at all. Everyone knows that experts' analysis, especially in terms of forecasting during crisis, is always more accurate than machine-based analysis. For example, the exhibition in Malaya Gruzinskaya in 1983 had a Kabakov, and I have a poster for that exhibition. Well, I think you can add many parameters, but like all these puzzles are making us to look for some explanations, like why Kovalev looks one way in one press and has a quite different look in a different publication, just because he is not just a writer, but he also orders or commissions others to write. So it's like 2 different people. It's like good of one, good of number 2. They are completely 2 different identifications, and this is a good question related to professional identification. We just excluded this from our professional discourse, and I already mentioned this on the 8th of May. For example, one critic is writing about a person. He writes about art, and it means that all those people that he writes about is an artist, but there is a real artist, a bad artist, and a good artist, and a bad word Glazunov. There is a modality of relations. Then there's also professional identification, because in the 70s and 80s, those artists that exhibited in Oscar Rabin's barracks, they didn't have any professional identification before 1976. They were not members of the artists' union. They could be laureates of some awards, but they were never members of professional artists' union. So this is a very important thing for the 60s and 70s. Then Andronov was the member of artists' union, and he had this artist that belonged to like tough style, like severe or rough style, and he fit within the Soviet layer of artists. Then there were other artists that created art for a fee, like, for example, some were apprentice for Kabakov, for example. Then somebody made illustrations for books. Then some worked on real estate market in order to pay rent of their studio. And then many artists sold their works to some collectors, and we don't know anything about it. So your results cannot take into account all these things, and you can't really calculate all those things. I'm not sure if it's possible to do technically. And the professional identification is very important for sociologists that you always give as an example. If we speak about IMDb database, they are all protected by their trade unions. The director of photography cannot just come to the film set. And you just can't do your professional activity without like belonging to a certain system. So there are different levels of this. And if you have, do you have any objections to what I have said? What do you think about my comment related to the artist and the work of art, which are completely different things? It was related to my presentation, I guess, more. I don't know. If I, let's say, replaced in my study artists with the work of art, I don't think a lot changed. The work of the dead artist, I meant. I guess the results wouldn't have changed if I used works of art instead of artists in my research. I said that if there was a connection between some dots, it didn't mean that there was some friendship relations or drinking vodka. It was the participation in the exhibitions. Of course, it's the professional identification is very important, but you have to ask this question directly. How do you identify yourself? You can say, I'm a sick person, I'm a woman, I'm a mother, or I'm a neighbor. But the problem with this data is that this is historical data. Let's say we come to Kabakov today and ask him, how did you identify yourself in 1962 or in 1990? We wouldn't get anything. People tend to lie, people tend to forget, and this is normal for many social studies. Because for people it's very difficult to talk about the past. Of course, we can discuss this with artists of today's time or of the year 2000. But Valentin said about historical data as well. There are the reference books of the Union of Artists, and you can get a lot of information from there. We can look at the professional identification imposed on the artist by the state. Well, Oleg Vasiliev was the member of the Soviet Union of Artists, many others. This was the level of socialization at that time. It was the level of compromise that the artist could go for. I think no matter what trade union was there for Rabin or Kabakov, it would be more interesting to see how our art became institutionalized, how they got recognized. For example, many artists had nothing to sell. So what filter are we going to use? I guess the context of the underground is important, and exhibitions is not the strongest point. You used 4 parameters. You spoke about exhibitions, which is not exactly the right thing, because there was the underground during the Soviet Union. Like after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you could use this as a main thing. Well, I can't agree with this. Even though there were certain requirements that the underground had, like Glaser showed an exhibition in Tbilisi, and of course the exhibition that took place in Richter's flat were a completely different thing. But if the artists appeared at the different venues, whether it's a barrack or Kurchatov Institute wall, it's not by chance that one artist appears next to another artist. Sometimes the decisions were pretty tough with regard to where and who should be exhibited. So it was a special institute separate from the Union of Artists. I wanted to make a comment related to who and where the artists exhibited. I remember an artist saying, my work is hanging next to modernist artists. It means I'm part of history. I remember an exhibition in VDNH. There was the bee breeding pavilion, and the artists that were selected to be exhibited there because they were willing to cooperate with the government structures. And then there was another exhibition that was like an anarchists exhibition, so they were completely different. But there was the same jury for both pavilions, and the jury consisted of artists that selected works, and they didn't accept Kommer and Melamid, and Ilya Kabakov refused to participate there, so his work was replaced. So during 60s, 70s and early 80s, the artists had like self-organized groups. So there was some core group of artists that would accept some and would reject others. And Mikhail Raginsky can never make it to that list, just because the core group sort of signed them off. But he is there. Raginsky was there. Let me make a brief comment. I have a feeling that art historians work only for art historians. But the question is, who is your target audience? Who is going to read your articles? And getting back to the question related to works of art and artists, I'm not a professional, I'm an amateur, and I just know that many artists that were exhibited in the same exhibition, that appeared in the same article, don't like each other. For example, we have many classical examples that Degas didn't like Monet, and they hated themselves, they hated each other, but they appeared to belong to the same group, and they appeared to be hanging next to each other on the museum wall. So it works here in the similar way. Maybe in one article, two people that didn't like each other came together, and sometimes articles worked against the intention of the author. I wanted to ask a question related to the second research and to the second speaker, the second presentation, the second group of speakers. When you spoke about some assumptions and the studies that were completed in the North American Academy and focused on some commercial production. So the mechanisms of social capital accumulation that exist in some advanced cultural practices in a Russian context. And were there any mechanisms, were there similar things that existed in the Soviet totalitarian state? And were there any differences between Soviet Russia and abstract art? Well, we analyzed only the materials in the 1990s. We didn't analyze anything related to the 60s and 70s. And we can't really speak much about the relationships. We can just identify the structure, and we can calculate the details of the model related to the core and the periphery, and it's very similar to the study that was conducted in Hollywood. We don't have the measure of recognition, and that's why we can't really say what determines the place in the core and the periphery. And for example, Dilyara's pictures showed the density and how the density grew. So, like people first were more isolated, so the density was low, and then later the density became higher. So we don't have the measure of recognition, and that's why we can't really say much about it. We can only speak about descriptions. So I guess what you have to do is to write the history of art that would be easy to understand both for Russian audience and international audience, because the history of art that can be received from the catalogs or like Ekaterina Dёготь book or Ekaterina Bobrinskaya, Ekaterina Andreeva books about history of art. So it means that their books are not exactly satisfactory because maybe the catalogs and that information which is written there is for less wide, for smaller audience. Actually, thank you for your question, because those three books were the starting point for us, because we wanted to understand what should we do with it. And after reading those books, I had this need, an internal need to understand why this author wrote about that artist in particular, while he was not noticeable at all during the underground period of art. Then the second author is removing a lot of events just because the writer is not interested in that, and the writer says, "Oh, I'm not interested, so I'm not going to write about it." There is the history of art by Grabar and Vazai. They are also quite subjective works, but there must be some knowledge base, and we are looking for it. I guess art critics had some art background, some education in the history of art. So I guess this was like a suggestion from sociologists to shake up the art historians and find some new approaches. Well, we are working professionally and institutionally, so it was interesting for us to see how these materials could be seen from a different perspective through the angle of a different science. But there is such thing as sociology of art. This was the discipline that appeared during Soviet period of time. Yes, I'm a sociologist of art. We have completely different things there. I'm a follower of Fyodor Davidov, but I guess they were always calculating something. We have to understand what units of measure are we going to use. You know, there's this cartoon, a Russian cartoon, whether we are going to measure in terms of rabbits or boa or snake or some other animals. But again, this is a methodological question. So, like, are these parrots or boa? Or what is it? This is media mentioning. You asked, who are critics writing for? I don't say that like it's important to take into account some personal context. I think at least two parameters could be considered, the presence and the absence of the artist. Because in 1990s, Kabakov was not here. His works were here. He was mentioned, but he was not here physically. So your studies, your findings make a huge puzzle for me. I don't think there's some ideal version of this. I think you should use many parameters, and every stage of this research is like the theory that you mentioned. Like the success of an artist changes the field. It's like every next research will change the field. Like on the 8th of May, there was one picture. Now you changed it completely. I got rid of dead artists and foreign artists. No, you didn't do this. You you got lots of dead people there. It's not about the audience that we're writing for. It's true that media has some specifics. We use Glazunov as a swear word. We like to mention it as an institutionalized but a bad artist. So it's interesting to look at all these things, but the quality of the structure of the incoming material matters more here. There is a subjective history that Zina speaks about, and then there's an attempt to calculate it so that it would have like multiple vectors. Well, many people would be interested to see those diagrams. It would be a very emotional experience because probably you would feel like you would feel sorry for those located in the periphery and those critics that has just a connection with one artist. But it's a not well-tuned instrument. I can't say that it's a method disadvantage. And you have to tune it, to fine-tune it, and there have to be many, many layers. It has to be a multifaceted thing. I'm actually thinking of two more layers that we can use in the textual analysis. Like the typology of the text, whether it was a review or an interview or some other kind of text. You remember there was this game, The Prince of Persia. There was an old computer game, and it was called The Prince of Persia, and there were these huge mountains. I just remembered Loach's novel, and the main character is a writer, and so he is looking for a word that was mentioned most of the times, and this word that was mentioned most of the times was filth, and it was David Lodge. And now I'm going to play the role of Devil's defender. I guess you just want to share your responsibility. You want to you should just make this list yourself. You should just draw up the list, and then select all the key figures. You can start with historiography. If you are going to continue, then like 10 years, in 10 years you'll have an objective picture. You should just change some things. And I'm sure that in 10 years' time it will be very objective. If we speak about a person and not about a machine, would you be happy if Glazunov is mentioned in textbooks? Well, we are not eternal, right? My today's students ask questions that you could never think about like 5 years ago. They ask, what is official art? Who are all these people? So we should work in this field. Why should we use the term official art? The young artist that wants to understand the prehistory do not understand the context of opponents. Who was Andronov, for example? They should go to the Tretyakov Gallery and see all the artists. If there's no ground, you shouldn't draw a tree without this ground. Let's say there's Tahir Salahov, and so he is an artist and an administrator, and he's also Aydan Salahova's father. But you can't live without this filth. I can see that we should close up our discussion. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. We are going to continue our work. We are going to fine-tune and upgrade this work. Thank you.